The night of June 17th, 2009 was supposed to be like any other in Kennedale, Texas. But by morning, a quiet suburban neighborhood would be left in shock. Police responding to a 911 call found a home engulfed in flames, and inside, a crime so brutal it would haunt the community for years. The man at the center of it all? John Hummel, a husband, a father, a neighbor who on the surface seemed ordinary. But behind closed doors, something far darker was brewing. 12 years after being on death row, Texas carried out his execution. According to him, he's not afraid of dying. Jesus Christ is waiting for him up there to accept his soul. It was the kind of neighborhood where people left their doors unlocked at night. A place where the sound of children riding bicycles and neighbors greeting each other across the yard was more common than anything sinister. Burleson, Texas, just outside of Fort Worth, carried that illusion of safety. It was suburban, quiet and ordinary. But in December of 2009, beneath that surface of normalcy, a tragedy was quietly taking shape inside the modest, single-story home of John Hummel. John Clinton Hummel was not a man who drew much attention. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't a community leader, and he wasn't known for any particular achievement. To most, he was just another face in a working-class Texas town. He had a wife, a young daughter, and even a father-in-law who lived with them. To outsiders, his life seemed steady, perhaps not remarkable, but stable. But as every true crime investigator knows, appearances can be deceiving. Hummel's story would eventually become one of betrayal, brutality, and chilling calculation. He wasn't just a man pushed too far or someone who snapped in a moment of rage. The evidence would suggest something darker, a plan that had been simmering, a decision that involved choosing selfish desire over human life. And what makes the case all the more haunting is the sheer coldness with which he carried it out. Before the murders, Hummel was known by neighbors as soft-spoken, maybe even a bit awkward. He had been married to Joy Hummel for several years, and they had a young daughter, Jody, who was just 5 years old in 2009. Joy's father, Clyde Merle Bedford, had moved into the home as well, making the household a 3-generation family. To those who knew them, they looked like any other Texas family making ends meet, living simply, supporting one another, and raising a child. But inside that home, tensions were mounting. John Hummel was not satisfied with his life, he wasn't satisfied with his marriage, and most importantly, he wasn't satisfied with the responsibilities that came with being a husband and father. Like so many cases in the annals of true crime, his discontent began to manifest in ways that no one around him could have fully predicted. Hummel had quietly started an affair. His mistress was younger, energetic, and represented to him the life he thought he deserved, one without the burdens of bills, responsibilities, and family obligations. Investigators would later uncover that Hummel had spoken about a future with her, fantasizing about a life unshackled by his marriage and family ties. This is where the story shifts from ordinary unhappiness into something sinister. Most people in troubled marriages pursue divorce, separation, or counseling. But Hummel began to craft a darker solution. Instead of working through his dissatisfaction or leaving peacefully, he began to imagine a life where his wife, his daughter, and his father-in-law simply didn't exist anymore. For investigators who later pieced together the crime, this was the chilling core of the case. Hummel wasn't just lashing out in anger. He was clearing the board, wiping away every obstacle that stood between him and the new life he wanted. In the days leading up to the crime, nothing outwardly alarming seemed to be happening. Joy Hummel was preparing for the holidays. Little Jody was likely full of excitement, as children often are in December. Merle Bedford, Joy's father, was quietly living out his days in his daughter's home. But John Hummel had already set his mind. He had a vision of a different life, and December 17th would be the day he acted on it. The Hummel home, located on Diane Street, was modest, a typical suburban Texas house. That evening, neighbors didn't hear any shouting. There were no loud arguments or disturbances to hint at the violence about to erupt. But by dawn, smoke would be billowing from the house, and the quiet street would be transformed into a crime scene that left investigators horrified. What happened inside that house is something that detectives, first responders, and even prosecutors would later describe as one of the most brutal family annihilation cases they had ever seen. Sometime in the night, John Hummel attacked his family. Armed with a baseball bat, he first went after his wife, Joy. The blows were merciless, leaving her battered and broken. He then turned on his father-in-law, Merle, striking him down with the same weapon. And in an act that shocked even seasoned investigators, he attacked his own daughter, little Jody. The brutality didn't stop there. After killing them, Hummel set the house on fire. Whether this was an attempt to cover up the crime or simply an extension of his destructive intent, investigators would later debate. But one thing was certain. By the time firefighters arrived, the house was engulfed, and the family inside was gone. For neighbors, the sight of flames pouring from the Hummel home was terrifying. They gathered outside, watching firefighters battle the blaze. It wasn't until after the flames were controlled that the true horror was discovered. Inside, the charred remains of Joy, Jody, and Merle were found. What made the scene especially haunting was the realization that this wasn't just a fire accident. Autopsies would reveal the extent of the trauma inflicted on the victims before the fire was set. This was no tragic house fire. It was a deliberate act of murder. When the news broke in Burleson, disbelief rippled through the community. Neighbors couldn't fathom how this could happen on their street. For many, the idea that John Hummel, the quiet husband and father, could be behind it seemed unthinkable. But investigators were already turning their attention toward him. Hummel's behavior in the hours and days after the fire raised red flags. He did not react like a grieving husband or father. Instead, his demeanor seemed detached, even cold. Investigators noticed his lack of visible emotion, and then there was his alibi, shaky, inconsistent, and eventually unraveling. Witnesses began to come forward with stories. Hummel had confided in people about wanting to start a new life. His mistress, in particular, became a crucial part of the investigation. She revealed that Hummel had talked about leaving his family, not through divorce, but in a way that implied something more final. For detectives, the pieces began to fit. The motive was clear. Hummel wanted to rid himself of his family so he could pursue a life with his mistress. The method was brutal. Shortly after the murders, Hummel disappeared. For investigators, this was confirmation of guilt. Innocent men don't vanish when their families are murdered. The search for him stretched beyond Burleson as law enforcement agencies coordinated to track him down. He was eventually arrested in Oceanside, California, trying to distance himself from the crime scene. But distance couldn't save him from the mountain of evidence piling up against him. Family annihilation cases are sadly not uncommon in true crime. But what makes the John Hummel case stand out is the sheer coldness of his actions. He wasn't in a rage. He wasn't acting out of sudden passion. This was calculated, deliberate, and fueled by nothing more than selfish desire. Investigators would later say that his actions revealed a chilling lack of humanity. To kill one's wife is one thing. To kill one's father-in-law is another. But to brutally bludgeon one's own child, a 5-year-old, is an act that defies comprehension. As at the time of the murder, the wife was pregnant. This was not just a crime of murder. It was an act of erasure. Hummel wanted to wipe away the life he had, down to the smallest member of his family, so that he could walk into a new one unburdened. With Hummel in custody, prosecutors began building their case. They had motive, opportunity, and a suspect whose behavior screamed guilt. But what they needed was to ensure that every detail was documented, every shred of evidence preserved, because this case was headed toward the ultimate punishment, the death penalty. The trial, when it finally came, would reveal even more disturbing details about Hummel's mindset. And in the end, justice would be sought not just for Joy and Merle, but for little Jody, the innocent child whose life was stolen by the one person meant to protect her most. The walls of the interrogation room were bare, the air heavy with cigarette smoke and tension. Across the table sat John William Hummel, a former Marine, his hands folded calmly in front of him. He had been caught at the California-Mexico border, his plan to escape unraveling faster than he imagined. For nearly 2 weeks, He had insisted he wasn't home the night his wife, his daughter, and his father-in-law were slaughtered. But now, under the dim light of the recording camera, his mask began to crack. "I was stupid," he muttered, almost under his breath. The detective leaned forward. "What do you mean, stupid?" Hummel's answer was chillingly flat. "I killed my family. Then I set the house on fire." No tears, no panic. Just words spoken like a man describing a broken appliance. He explained how he parked behind the house, slipping off his boots and watch like a soldier preparing for a mission. At first he tried to use a kitchen knife, planning to stab his wife Joy as she slept, but the blade was too dull. She woke up, startled, and fought back. That's when Hummel grabbed a baseball bat. He brought it down with brutal force over and over until she collapsed. He admitted he stabbed her with 2 decorative swords for good measure. Then he turned toward the bedroom of his father-in-law, Clyde Eddie Bedford, a 57-year-old wheelchair user who had little chance of defense. Hummel walked in and smashed the bat down onto his skull. Eddie died in his bed, never knowing why. Finally, Hummel admitted what no parent should ever be capable of. He walked into Jodi's room, his daughter asleep in her pajamas. "Same thing," he said coldly. "I hit her with a baseball bat, probably 5 to 10 times. Detectives in the room were stunned by his tone. There was no trembling voice, no hesitation. He spoke as if reading a shopping list. When asked why, Hummel offered a motive almost too absurd to believe. He had been infatuated with another woman, someone he hoped to pursue romantically. Divorce never crossed his mind. It was just animal instinct. He shrugged. Take them all out. In June 2011, when John Hummel was brought before a Texas jury, there was no doubt about his guilt. He had already admitted the unimaginable, that he had bludgeoned his pregnant wife Joy to death with a baseball bat, stabbed his 5-year-old daughter Jodi as she tried to escape, and then turned the same violence on Clyde Bedford, his elderly father-in-law who had lived with them. Afterward, he set their Kennedale home on fire in a desperate attempt to cover his tracks. What unfolded in court was not a debate over whether Hummel had committed these murders. He had confessed, even giving chilling details of how he carried out each act, but rather whether he would spend the rest of his life in prison or be executed by the state of Texas. The prosecution painted Hummel as a cold-blooded killer driven by selfish motives. They argued he slaughtered his family because he wanted to be with another woman he had met at a convenience store, someone he believed offered a new life free from responsibility. To them, this wasn't a crime of passion, it was calculated annihilation. Jurors heard testimony from investigators who recalled Hummel's confession, where he described Joy's screams, his daughter's terrified attempt to flee, and the deliberate decision to finish what he had started. Each word chilled the courtroom, forcing even seasoned officers to look away. Hummel's defense tried desperately to humanize him, pointing to his military service, his history of depression, and his struggles with life's pressures. They suggested he had simply snapped under unbearable weight, not plotted the killings. Yet, in the face of his own admissions, their arguments fell flat. Jurors saw not a man who lost control, but one who carefully executed a plan, then sought to erase it in flames. After deliberation, the jury returned with the only sentence they believed fit the crime: death. As the verdict was read, Hummel sat motionless, his face expressionless, as though he already knew his fate. Family members of Joy and Clyde wept in the gallery, clutching each other for strength. The words, "death by lethal injection," rang through the courtroom like a final bell tolling for the lives that had been taken. From there, Hummel was transferred to Polunsky Unit, Texas's notorious death row, where he would spend the next decade awaiting execution. He was just 33 years old when he entered that grey world of endless time, locked away for 23 hours a day in a small cell with nothing but his thoughts and the memory of what he had done. For Hummel, the trial was over, but the punishment, slow, suffocating, and inevitable, had only just begun. On Texas's death row, John Hummel became a man of silence. Unlike many inmates who filled their days writing letters, giving interviews, or proclaiming innocence, Hummel withdrew. Guards described him as polite, almost invisible. He kept to himself, never causing trouble, never drawing attention. His case was not a mystery. He had confessed in vivid detail, leaving little room for doubt. The question was no longer about guilt, but about waiting. Waiting for the state of Texas to decide when his life would end. For years he declined requests for interviews, but once, in a rare moment of openness, he spoke from behind the glass. His words were calm, almost chilling in their acceptance. "I'm not afraid to die," he said quietly. "Jesus is waiting for me." He explained that on the night of the murders, something inside him had shifted. "The urge was so strong," he confessed. "I'd never had that urge before. But when it came, I couldn't fight it." He didn't cry, didn't plead for forgiveness. Instead, he spoke with the resignation of a man who believed he had already been judged, not just by the courts, but by something higher. To those who heard him, it was unsettling. Here was a father who slaughtered his pregnant wife, his little girl, and his father-in-law, yet now spoke of peace, of salvation, of heaven. On death row, he kept a Bible close. Other inmates said he prayed often, but he never joined in the usual chatter or debates that filled the rows of cells. He seemed to accept isolation as his penance. Appeals came and went. Delays stretched the years longer, but Hummel's demeanor never changed. He wasn't fighting for life, only waiting for death. In that stillness, his words lingered. He wasn't afraid. He believed he'd be forgiven. And yet, for the families of his victims, forgiveness was impossible. For them, the years he spent in quiet reflection could never balance the horror of that December night. On death row, John Hummel remained unremarkable in many ways. Quiet, compliant, largely invisible. But behind the stillness, legal dramas churned. His attorneys mounted an array of appeals, arguing procedural flaws, conflicts of interest, and even seeking a stay of execution amid the COVID-19 pandemic. In March 2020, with Hummel's execution scheduled for March 18th, his defense filed an emergency motion. Executing him during the health crisis could imperil those involved. They pointed to a governor-declared state of disaster and TDCJ visitation bans. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted a 60-day stay, citing the enormous resources needed and pandemic risks, making it one of the first executions halted in Texas due to COVID-19. But other appeals faltered. They sought a new punishment hearing, claiming his trial lawyer later joined the prosecutor's office, a potential conflict. Courts rejected those claims. Attempts to secure federal funding for clemency experts were denied. The Fifth Circuit refused to stay his execution, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined review. Advocacy groups also raised their voice. An international appeal campaign argued Hummel had been a deserving model of good behavior in custody, a Marine with no prior violence history, and that the execution ignored concerns of inadequate defense and future dangerousness. Yet none of these protests yielded clemency. The date fixed, June 30th, 2021. That evening, just after 6 p.m., Hummel was escorted into Huntsville's execution chamber. Lethal pentobarbital was administered. At 6:49 p.m., 13 minutes later, he was pronounced dead. His final words, quiet, remorseful, and deeply human, cut through the tension. Strapped to the gurney, he offered a prayer, whispered of Jesus, then said, "I truly regret killing my family. I am thankful for all the thoughts and prayers for my family over the last few days. I love each and every one of you." When the curtain fell on the Huntsville death chamber, silence filled the witness room. John Hummel's chest rose and fell slowly, the sound of soft snores escaping his lips as the lethal drug took hold. Within minutes, his body grew still, his eyes shut as though he had simply drifted into a deep sleep. At 6:49 p.m., officials pronounced him dead. But for the family of his victims, there was no peace in watching him slip away so quietly. Joy's brother, standing among the witnesses, later voiced his anguish. "He went too easy. He snored a little, like he was falling asleep. My sister didn't go like that. She was bludgeoned 34 times with a baseball bat. My niece was struck the same way. My father was beaten too. They suffered, but he didn't. He got to just close his eyes." Those words captured the raw divide that executions often leave behind. For the family, Justice had been served, but it hadn't erased the torment of what their loved ones endured. The image of Joy fighting for her life, of little Jodie terrified in her own home, and of Clyde struck down in his bed. Those horrors lingered, untouched by the sterile calm of a state execution. To them, the punishment felt unequal. Hummel's death came swiftly, almost mercifully, while the people he killed suffered in ways too brutal to imagine. For Joy's brother, there could be no closure. Only the reminder of lives cut short and of the painful truth that no sentence, no matter how final, could ever balance the scales.